I have a broad question and a more prosaic one, and I want to introduce the broad question that is a continuation of something that you addressed in your talk, but also by quoting a very powerful passage from your book, Eco-Republic. You write, initiative requires a combination of knowledge to recognize urgency, the self-discipline to prioritize, the justice to care about contributing to the common good, and the sheer courage to step forward. Each of these is currently in short supply. Distorted judgments of self-interest deprive us of urgency in addressing sustainability. The limitations of our collective imagination and the laxity of our commitments to self-discipline and justice make it hard for us to prioritize drastic and systemic change. And the courage to step forward is hobbled not only by cowardice and fear, but also by a misplaced understanding of political propriety. So how, given the general short supply of all of these things, which I definitely agree are indeed in short supply, how does the individual find a context to act within? What do you see as the arena for action for the person who does wish to take initiative, and how does a non-heroic individual carry on without resonance from a context?
Yeah, great, thank you. I'm touched that you're such a devout reader of the book. Thank you for engaging with it. So I can say something more positive about the professions, because in the talk I was being a bit hectoring. The professions must do this and they must do that, they must rethink themselves. But actually there's a very positive thing that I think the professions can supply, which is precisely the sense of solidarity, and Plato would call it friendship, which can give individuals a source of energy to take initiative. So actually one of the really interesting things about the Socratic dialogues is that Socrates says, it's only important that you and I, who are now talking, agree. We may disagree with everyone else, but if we can find some agreement, then we can go on and act from there. And I think that actually the promise of the professions is in part that it can provide that sense of mutual support for people who might feel a bit lost or isolated otherwise in trying to take initiatives in what they're doing every day, if they can see themselves as part of a group that's together trying to come up with the solidarity to take initiative. So I think finding context for solidarity is an incredibly important part of eliciting these sorts of virtues and the ability to take initiative.
Okay, so now for the prosaic question, which I think some of the architects in the audience probably may have been thinking about as they listened to you. I suspect the objection that immediately will come to mind for architects to your sketching of the need to radically reform the conception of the profession and its norms is that architects are able to create the work that they create because they have clients. So how does one perform as an architect in your ideal vision without a client? I mean, you did say in your talk that an architect and a client together should be thinking about the long-term impacts and the relationship to the whole of what they do. I think many architects would tell you that would be great if it happened, but that's not the way things work. So how does a profession based on the client-professional relationship remake itself really through its own agency?
Yeah, thank you. So this is obviously a crucially important question, maybe the crucially important question in this discussion. So first I might say I appreciate how constraining this need to have a relationship with the client is, in the sense that if you're a composer, for example, you can just sit at home and compose, but if you're a conductor, you can't conduct unless you have an orchestra. And similarly, it's almost impossible to practice architecture on the ground unless you have a client. And so I understand that really is the defining context in which the art, the profession, has to be practiced. When I was thinking about this, I was thinking about what I thought might be a rather incendiary or controversial image from the history of political thought. And so I'll put it out there now and see if it incites some controversy, which was the thought of, so in the history of political thought, there is a debate about advisors to princes from the Renaissance. So Machiavelli, Thomas More, many other less familiar writers today have this, and it wasn't just princes, also advisors to republics, but advisors to anyone with political power. And those people, these people who were counselors or courtiers, exactly struggled with this question that they could only achieve the goals that they thought that they wanted to achieve by winning the favor of their client, as it were, the ruler whom they were serving. And that absolutely posed this moral dilemma for them. How do you speak truth to power? You know, how can you avoid flattery or self-abnegation? How can you remain true to your ideals? And if you read the first book of Thomas More's Utopia, this is absolutely about that. And More has two characters. The character named after himself counsels, well, you know, you do your best, you work within the confines, you try. And then there's another character who says, it's just hopeless. You should just give up and get out because it's just too compromising and it's too unlikely that you'll actually be able to succeed. In thinking about this, so that maybe dramatizes the dilemma more than actually enabling you to solve it. The resources that I would seize for solving it, again, lie in this conception of solidarity and actually of professional sort of standards that the profession sets. So if you think, well, clients choose architects partly on the basis of wanting the most prestigious, they want someone who's going to be cutting edge, to the extent that the profession can say to them, look, we set the norms for what's prestigious and cutting edge, and this is what we tell you is now prestigious and cutting edge. This is what we award in competitions. This is what we value in magazines. That even maybe just out of the motive of esteem will make clients interested in this. So I think it's very important that although I focused in the talk primarily on these direct ethical motives of virtue and the good, that's, I think, necessary to get the ball rolling. I think the way you get the ball of social and normative change rolling is by having some people who really are true believers. But lots of other people are going to follow on the basis of what becomes normal, what becomes admired, keeping up with the Joneses, and that's fine. I don't think one should at all scorn those motives. I think you want to enlist all of these motives, actually, in social change. So to the extent that the profession can try to set the norms that the clients are going to look to when they're choosing architects, that's the way that I think that you can try to open that space and try to win some space, you know, for making these changes. But I'm certainly going to acknowledge that it's not going to be easy. So, yeah.
Are there questions back here?
The whole time I was listening to the lecture, I did come in a bit late, but I kept thinking the problem is the problem of collective action, in a way, that you have individuals who are motivated by their own interests, and each one of them will do what's in their interest or in the interest of their client, because architects work with clients. But collectively, everybody loses.
Right.
And so my question is, based on what you just said, are you suggesting that the way in is not to try to motivate people individually through a kind of moral argument that this is your duty to do so because the earth is going to perish if we don't, but rather that architects should approach it on an institutionalized professional level?
I think what I was trying to describe in the talk was we've got into a kind of vicious circle in a way where, you know, we have certain professional norms that don't push us far enough. We feel bound by those norms. They can set a least common denominator as well as a kind of best practice denominator. Clients play into that. We don't push for political change. So all those things are problematic. And the question is, how do you break into a kind of vicious circle like that where the norms are supporting the individuals, are supporting, you know, and all that. And so my thought is you break it into it on all those levels. You know, it may be that you need certain individuals who are going to take the initiative in pushing those institutional bodies and collective bodies. But then absolutely, I think there is a crucial role for those professional bodies to play. And if they start to take up that challenge, that will make it easier for the individuals, and you can get a virtuous circle going. And I think that even what I was trying to suggest with the third set of antennae is that so often people will hear me give this kind of talk and they say, well, we just need political change. Until we get a carbon tax, everything is hopeless. And I absolutely agree that we need a carbon tax or the equivalent of a carbon tax. We need to price carbon clearly. But there are sort of two questions. One is, how do we get there? And the other is, what do we do in the meantime? So to say that we need, it's not an excuse for doing nothing in the meantime. And one of the, I think, underexploited political strategies is precisely for groups of businesses and professionals to say to politicians, we need you to do this. And this has actually been, this is what's now being tried with the immigration bill, of course, where people in business on both sides are saying the business lobby wants you to do this. In the UK, where I lived for many years, this was incredibly productive, both in bringing about the climate change bill, and now there's an attempt by the government currently to row back on some of the energy efficiency targets, and groups of business people are saying, we want those targets because they make it easier for us to do our job and to make money doing it. So I think there's a role for the professions in redefining their own norms and in pressing the government to try to change policy in a way that can give the profession more breathing space in then also going further in the changes that it wants to make. So I would say, at all those levels, there's a role for individuals, but I think the role for the professional bodies is really, quite possibly very, very important.
It's been a while since I read political philosophy, so excuse my recall. But I think my question is, with people like Rousseau and Martin Luther King and any modern political philosopher who came before climate change, is that there, and even in professional practice, is that there were so many causes, for Rousseau it was equality, just to have the right to vote. I mean, maybe that's what informed his thing that you critiqued there. So I guess my question is, so now, we're struggling to try and make some kind of environmental moral platform, which seems like a really hard thing to develop and to kind of, and I know you said, well, there's this whole imagination thing that needs to happen, but, so I guess I'm curious, is that with the, if you, what have you found for the ancient Greeks, if anything? Because to me, they might have existed before these, all these social events happen, like equality and the end of racism and all these things that we've been struggling with the past 200 years, and now we have this new thing that's related back to nature, which we haven't really considered in a long time. So I was wondering because obviously we have to reimagine some kind of relationship to nature that will inspire us, to action. And so I was wondering if the Greeks had a certain way that they related to nature and scarcity and their resources, which were surely limited, and how they, I know they had lots of nature gods and stuff, and I don't know what we can do with that, but I think that's, like, how can they inform us to try to remake a relationship with nature?
So on the first question, in a way, my thought is that precisely we were told in the 18th century, and this is how the 18th century thinkers themselves, including Rousseau and Smith, saw it, is that we've gotten beyond the Greeks and the Romans precisely because now we have the market, and the market is going to bring about good social outcomes through indirection in a way that the Greeks and Romans thought that they could only achieve by being virtuous citizens and acting directly and collectively. So that was what so the 18th century said, in a way, that was too ambitious an ideal of being a virtuous citizen. It took up too much time. People had slaves. That's how they were able to do it. So fortunately, now we can afford to leave all of that behind and just trust in the division of labor and the market. It's going to bring about these good outcomes. And that worked for a couple of hundred years, and it has brought about a lot of good outcomes, but now it's bringing about some very bad outcomes. And so my thought is precisely because that modern solution is starting to hit the wall in a way, it's helpful to go back to the Greeks and think, well, what were the aspects that we thought we could afford to leave behind, but maybe now we find that we can't afford to leave them behind. Maybe we can bring them back and use them to temper this modern idea that we can just let it all come out in the wash of, of the unintended consequences. And so to do that is a challenge, and I think you're right to mention some of the ways that we, as I mentioned in the talk, Plato had a hierarchical, elitist conception of what politics was going to look like. We have to ask, is that something that we can learn anything from for democratic politics? And my sort of hypothesis is that yes, that there are certain ways of seeing the relation between the individual and the society that still are very valuable, even when we have to reimagine them and put them in the context of these modern relations. So that's the sort of bet that I've made in a way, and that I'm trying to work out in my research. Now, I would never say the Greeks tell us everything we need to know and we should leave behind everything that we've got from modernity, but rather, insofar as modernity's promise has been fulfilled in some ways and is now running into quicksand in others, it's worth thinking, did we abandon some resources that could still be helpful? So the second part of your question was about nature and the Greeks and nature, and this is very interesting, and it's something that I'm only really beginning to think about. I started my research really thinking about the social aspect, and now only I'm extending it to really think about what can they tell us about nature. One thing that's interesting about the Greek idea of nature is that they had an idea that it might only happen kind of for the most part. So whereas we've been brought up to think of laws of nature as exceptionless and absolutely universal, the Greeks were aware that as they understood it, things had certain natural tendencies, but they weren't always realized. And their understanding of those natural tendencies might involve some sort of a good end or a telos. And then the question is, what happens when that's interfered with, when that can't be realized? I think the other aspect that might be helpful for us is this thought about scarcity and sufficiency, as you mentioned, because one of the aspects of certainly Aristotle's economic theory is to say, again, we should think about the goals of economics, right? The goals of economics aren't just unlimited acquisition. They're related to what we need to live a sufficiently good life. And so there might be inherent limits to making money, for example, that actually make sense when you think, is making money really an absolute end in itself, or is it valuable insofar as it's an instrument to serve other ends that we care about? So those ideas of a kind of limit and sufficiency built into the idea of an economy, I think can be still instructive for us today.
Are there other, yeah, Jim?
I think what has happened is this kind of really radical individualism that's taken over, at least in American politics, that doesn't really recognize an idea of citizenship as you describe it, or cosmopolitanism, but is all about the individual, perhaps the family, perhaps the neighborhood, but certainly is suspicious of, society in a much bigger, broader way of thinking about it. Curious.
I'm sort of conscious when I give this talk that it might sound like a lot of pieties and sort of something obvious, but then there's another sense in which you bring out, it sounds like something not obvious at all, and kind of antithetical to the way that many people might think. And I think that, so in that sense, I really do mean it to be a challenge. I don't mean it to just be articulating things that are obvious or that we take for granted, but rather to say, I think that to the extent that an idea of individualism rejects or minimizes the context of the whole relations to which the individual contributes, either for good or ill, I think that isn't a sustainable concept of individualism in the modern era, where we're aware of the feedback loops, that every individual is part of causing. So I think actually, rebuilding this awareness and this conception of citizenship is something really urgent. It's not something that we can take for granted that people think. But I would say that, I don't mean this to be, as I said at the beginning, I think that this conception of sustainability is compatible with a wide range of conceptions of the good. So it's not that this is something that we should all be liberals or we should all be socialists, but rather that, you might think it's important to prioritize the individual in certain ways and we should defend certain rights. And that might be an important political project, but even that project has to, I think, now be aware of and be tempered by these relations of sustainability. So I don't think that this should close down political disagreement. It's not something that's meant to be, it's meant to be a kind of meta conception in a way, rather than one that, that directly take sides on one side or the other of the political spectrum. Now, making it that kind of, giving force to that kind of meta conception is a political challenge in itself, and I see that, and that's where I think it is a real challenge. But it's not meant to be something that only people from one side could sign up for. Whether they will sign up for it is another question, but it's not meant in principle to foreclose the possibility that people with very different ideas might all come to recognize it. But please go on.
Well, there's just a little, if you don't mind, a little follow-up, which is there a sort of philosophical basis that's emerged in the last couple of decades that accounts for this kind of rejection of, cosmopolitanism, I guess, or citizenship, as you've described?
This is a big story. Clearly there are social changes and sort of socio-political movements in a way that have promoted this. So in Britain, Thatcher famously declared there's no such thing as society. And that's sometimes thought to find its roots in the thought of someone like Friedrich von Hayek, for example, I think is one person to whom this is attributed. Actually, I think Hayek's thought is much more complex than that. So, to the extent that he's meant to be the basis for this, it's partly a misunderstanding. Hayek himself, and it's someone that I have studied and written about, I think he's actually a very interesting thinker in many ways. But his idea was actually, he was as much of a Burkean conservative in some ways. He thought that, in fact, an idea of society has grown up, which is kind of fragile in certain ways, and that we shouldn't undermine that idea of society. And even in practical terms, he thought that a very minimal kind of, or at least a welfare floor for people was something that his political philosophy would support. So, that's kind of one example of where some of that comes from, but it might be in part misunderstood. I think, in American political thought in particular, there's been some very interesting work being done recently by the philosopher Elizabeth Anderson at the University of Michigan, for example, that suggests that there's a kind of tension going back to the 19th century of how one thinks about the relationship between equality and liberty, and that the attempt to advance an idea of liberty which is completely divorced from any idea of equality is part of what's been underpinning this attack on citizenship and this attack on society. But again, she would suggest that there are ways of trying to combat that and to show that it's not ultimately a very satisfactory way of thinking. So I think there are philosophical movements here and as well as political movements, and it is, I think, a real task to try to rebuild an idea of citizenship in the face of them.
Just to follow up on that a little bit, with all the emphasis on individual responsibility, I fear that we are letting our leaders off the hook to some extent, because what's self-evident is the disconnect between those individuals who want to be good stewards of the earth and the social structures that don't support that. And I think we have to examine that the role of government is to compensate for the lack of individuals to do the right thing. And therefore, this is the role of society in the history of the world. So Well, I think everyone would agree that the role of the individual to take on these responsibilities as a participant in society is probably indisputable. What is the role of the government in order to in relationship to that? And how do we address the current disconnect clearly between the individual steward citizenship and the lack of, I would say, global citizenship on the part of our social structures, particularly in this country?
Yeah, thank you. So, in a democratic society, even one that's riven by severe wealth inequalities and so inequalities of political access and influence, I think there is still a sense in which ultimately, in the long run, people get the government that they deserve on some level. I mean, that they make possible, or we make possible, or don't do enough to make possible. And so in a sense, that's the examples that I was giving earlier of the ways that business leaders, but also not just business leaders, unions, pressure groups of all kinds can form together to try to demand that government takes action, I think is the way that one can get government to take action. Now, ideally, you would have government leaders themselves taking on these ethical roles as individuals, and I would want to appeal for that. But if it doesn't happen, then the role of other individuals is to both create the political space and the political pressure simultaneously in order to compel, or at least make possible for political leaders to take action. And so that's in a way why I put emphasis on the role of individuals, the role of these intermediate associations like professional groups, not because I don't think government is important, but because I think in a democracy those are the roots that we have to try to get government to act. And of course, crucially, including political parties and political mobilizations of different kinds. It might be worth saying a bit about the individual and individual industries, because this is another part of my argument in the book that I didn't say anything about tonight in tonight's talk. But I think often people feel, well, what I do as an individual or what my sector does is negligible with respect to the overall problem. So you often hear, and I've collect quotations of sectors like the airline industry saying, well, we are only 2% of the problem, or a construction industry will say, well, we're only 3% of the problem, as if being only 2% or 3% is a reason to kind of be let off the hook. But actually, when you look at the structure, particularly of the climate change problem, there's nobody who's really, as it were, more than 2% or 3% or say 7%. There's no 59% actor or 72% actor. Everyone is only a small part of the problem. And some work by my colleagues at Princeton, Stephen Pacala and Rob Sokolow, they did this very important work on what they called stabilization wedges. So they worked out the way that you could divide up all the carbon dioxide emissions equivalents that we need to cut, and then they divided this into 7 wedges of sort of sufficiently big to take action. But you could divide that into 14, and then that's only 7%. And so, actually, I think that what we need to get away from this thought that, well, I or my industry or my city or my state or my sector or my country are only a tiny percent of the problem, because everyone is only a tiny percent. No one is more than that tiny percent. And so actually the role of the individual in the structure of the problem is both small, but also it's not as if we can hide behind someone else who has a greater responsibility. And I think that's actually very important. Yeah. Thinking about education, I know a lot of programs or some schools are starting to develop more liberal arts approaches to architecture, and they're arguing that that makes the student a more well-rounded citizen, because then they can take environmental courses and urban studies courses and anthropology courses. And then on the other side of that accredited program, bachelor 5-year program, they have kind of the more specialized route. I know you've referenced Plato's Republic, and he talks about specialization, and when you're specialized, that is a part of being a just and active citizen. It's when you're really pursuing what suits you best. So I'm just kind of wondering, when you said that the profession should be headed in a direction where they kind of are redefining what it means with the clients and business strategy, if you think that that should start
in the universities, or if that should start in the profession and then kind of trickle down and be something that becomes more uniform. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Absolutely. So let me say two things about it. So one is, I think even the liberal arts, insofar as, I teach at a liberal arts university, I think we are only beginning to really take sufficient steps to think about what it would mean to even integrate within the liberal arts an understanding of sustainability and its implications for citizenship and for all of the professions. So, I think many different universities and colleges are experimenting with ways, how do you get how do you get the humanities into the environment, and how do you get the environment into every student's education in that broader sense? So, in a way, even if one takes the liberal arts routes, that doesn't settle that question, because you then still have to think, how do we do this within the liberal arts? And that's, I think, a challenge that the liberal arts are now facing. But I think, insofar as I speak, and I was going to say at one point, I think I didn't in the end, I speak from that profession of academics as opposed to, say, architects. And I think this is a challenge for us as academics, actually, is that we, too, are used to only thinking about our own small bit and kind of somehow assuming that if we each publish on our own small area of research, that will contribute to sufficient social benefit. But if we're not ourselves tackling these big questions and trying to figure out how we work together across the disciplines to do that, then we are also derelict in our professional responsibilities. And I take that as a challenge for myself. Just a footnote on Plato's Republic, because you brought that in an interesting way. I think it is really interesting that in the Republic, there's this interplay between specialized roles on the one hand, and then the idea that the guardians have this ability to understand the good and the whole, and so to direct all of the specialized roles on the other hand. And in a way, what I want to do in sort of democratizing the ideas of the Republic is to say, if we don't have guardians occupying some special position, then we need to build that into the specialized roles. So we can still have specialized roles. And that's actually, again, in an earlier draft, I had this thought that actually one of the things Plato's Republic offers us is this idea of specialized roles, precisely, that we've, in the Rousseauian model of citizenship, we don't want to admit that there's specialization or differentiation, but Plato gives us that. But then we need to build in this perspective of the good and the responsibility for the whole somehow and combine that with the specialization. And we don't have many models of how to do that, actually. I think we've sort of lost the sense that that is a responsibility, and I think it's a challenge for every profession to think about in every context. How do we do that?
I have one kind of comment and one question. The comment goes to what was said before on leaving off the hook to our leaders.
Sorry.
Yeah, just one thing. When we leverage our role as citizens, I was wondering to what extent is our expectations of perfection from leaders, from political leaders particularly, and the fear they have on commenting or even being open about failure is an obstacle.
Yeah.
And then one question. You talked about leveraging our role as citizens besides that as professionals, and I was wondering if there was some other role you see critical in terms of advancing sustainability.
Thank you for those questions. I would want to say to the second question, all our roles, so any role that we have, it might work out in different ways, but actually that citizenship is an adverb for all of those roles, and how do we think that through? On the first question and the fear of failure, and this maybe also brings me back to the question about politicians and are we letting them off the hook too easily? It's actually really interesting to think of politician as a profession and what are the structures and the limits to that professional role. And of course, if you think of what's the equivalent of sort of money making in politics versus the intrinsic good of the profession, it's getting reelected, right? And so it's sort of, the goal of politics isn't to get reelected, it's to do good while you're in office. But the thing that seems necessary in order to practice that profession is to be reelected. And one of the really challenging aspects of Plato's Republic, again, is actually the thought that the people that you want in power are precisely people who don't want power, because it's those people who will be in power for the right reasons and who will use their power for the right reasons, whereas if people are in power because they want power, they're then going to be caught up in a kind of cycle of seeking re-election, seeking power for its own sake that will distract them from these goals. So that's a very challenging kind of thought. And, I have sometimes thought that, I think one of the problems actually in the aspirations that we encourage in young people today is that we don't tend to encourage them to go into politics. We encourage, people who are very idealistic tend to go to work for NGOs or they go into the professions, but they don't necessarily go into politics. And, just as we have Teach for America, you kind of wonder, should we have Be a Politician for America, where people might go into it for a few years. Now the problem is that the way that it's now organized is that it's hard to have enough impact unless you gain seniority. But it might be that some of those things are things that we have to rethink, that actually people who come in for a short period and with a defined mission might actually bring something very important to the political sphere precisely because they're not seeking re-election for its own sake, and that that might be an important an important thing. So I think we have to rethink politicians as a profession, and actually the challenge that was raised by the previous question, or 2 questions ago, and by this last question, I think helped to pose that to me as an extension of this talk that I hadn't thought sufficiently about. But how do we think about the role of politician and its role as a profession, its relation to the goals of sustainable citizenship? And that's certainly something I would want to do in future research.
Thank you so much for giving us a huge amount to think about and chew on, and thank you for your enthusiasm for this project. So thank you.
Thank you.